All right, today's topic is topic 4, meeting the need for food and fiber. So here is just looking at a map. I think I've shown a similar map like this before. Top commodities by province and territory. So Canada is one of the leading exporters of food and fiber in the world. All right, so just looking here at some of the different products. So looking at, for example, BC with this symbol here, that would be dairy, and this symbol here, horticulture. Alberta, this symbol here, grains and oil seeds, as well as cattle. All right, that's just showing there in Alberta. So before we continue, there's this term sustainability. So being able to grow food and fiber while keeping our natural systems healthy for long term. So keeping in mind the environment and what is sustainable for our environment and keeping our environment healthy. So agriculture in Alberta, so Aboriginals had lived with nature for thousands of years. Then European pioneers, when they came, they began to cut down forests. They began to cultivate the grasslands so that they could grow crops. Wood was being used for construction, for manufacturing, as well as fuel. So settlers, they occupied nearly all of the grassland in the prairie provinces, and they had plowed up so much of the native plants that had grown there for thousands of years. So of the 60 million hectare land area of Alberta, over 20 million is now managed as farmland. The crops that are being grown in Alberta are these 7 crops, and including the specialty crops. So wheat, which is ground up for flour. We have barley, which is fed to livestock. It's also used for making malt flavoring. We have oats, which are mostly fed to livestock, but it's also for breakfast cereals and so on. We have legumes. Legumes include things like beans, lentils, peas, which are high in protein. Canola, which is used to make margarine, salad dressings, vegetable oil, and so on. Potatoes, like eating potatoes just as is, or French fries, potato chips, and so on. Alfalfa, which feeds livestock. It's also got a strong root system, so it's a strong crop. Specialty crops, which include things like ginseng, other beans, sunflowers, and spices. All right, so that's a quick summary of crops that are grown in Alberta. All right, next we're going to talk about some farming practices. So one practice you may have seen is irrigation. So you may have seen these on farmlands, these huge systems to water crops. So when we talk about irrigation, these are watering crops using a system of these large pipes and sprinklers. And then another one is monoculture. So monocultures is when farmers are only growing one type of plant in the field for greater efficiency and greater yield of that crop. All right, so we'll stop here and just watch this quick video from National Geographic. All right, so next we're going to talk about farming then and farming now. So this is from the textbook. So you will be using the textbook to do a little bit more reading. But here in the early 1900s and the technology back then, the cultivator, lots of animals were being used like oxen or horse-drawn. Some farmers cultivate in the spring to loosen the soil for seeds. That was also killing off any weeds. Other farmers use chemicals to kill weeds instead. So this was what was happening in the early 1900s. Technology of today, we have huge machines called cultivators that are used to prepare and fertilize the soil. The next activity, for example, fertilizer is being added to provide more nutrients for plants. So early 1900s, manure was the common source of fertilizer. Manure from, for example, cattle was being used. And now we have lots of artificial fertilizers that are being used. In the past, for example, for fungi, there were few controls for fungi in the early years. Now we're using a lot more chemicals to control fungi. Before, seeds were being spread by hand. Now we have machinery like air seeders and seed drills that are used to plant seeds. How were weeds and insects controlled in the past? Families, they used to send out their children. They were pulling the weeds by hand. Now we have, again, chemicals and pesticides and insecticides and so on that are being sprayed onto the crops. So lots of chemicals are being used to control weeds and insects. Other farmers, they may be using other methods that don't use chemicals. So for example, we had talked about like biological control. Grains are cut to allow it to dry and ripen. So farmers used like the scythe to cut crops. Now we have lots of machinery. When grain is threshed, threshing means separating the grain from other plant materials. For example, wind can help by removing the lighter stem and seed. In the early 1900s, it was done by hand to separate grain from the rest of the plant. The straw was just tossed into the air and caught in a basket, and so on. Now we have, again, combines, which are used to harvest grain and separate seeds. Then the grain was hauled for storage or to market. So horse-drawn carts were used in the past. Now we have large trailer trucks. In the past, how did we turn the soil and mix it and so on? So it was a horse-drawn plow was used. Now we have a modern plow. All right, next, saving soil moisture. So soil, it needs to be moist enough for crops to grow, even in dry weather. So like we had seen before, the irrigation systems, moisture is being lost continuously through like evaporation from the soil and through transpiration in the leaves. So farmers that are closer to rivers and large lakes, they can add moisture using those irrigation systems. All right, so water from lakes, reservoirs, and rivers is channeled into these large irrigation canals to provide water to farms. All right, so here again is an irrigation system, which are those large sprinklers used for irrigation. Here's an irrigation canal. All right, so these farmers are diverting the water from like rivers, lakes, and so on, and bringing it into this canal, this man-made canal, so that water is closer to the farms. All right, next, forestry. It's a major industry in Canada. So again, when we talk about diversity, that's when there's a large variety of plants and animals in an ecosystem. So when we look at a forest, it's much more than just the trees. There's different types of trees. There are shrubs, smaller plants, and of course many animals and many organisms. So species in a forest community are very interdependent. So all species are affected when this balance is disturbed. So forestry practices can actually increase the diversity of forest species by careful cutting that lets more light and air into the forest. So just looking at common trees that are found in Alberta. So there's the lodgepole pine, which is largely used in construction. We have the white spruce for plywood, pulp, and paper. The black spruce for lumber and strong paper. Aspen, which is good for furniture, pulp, and paper. The white birch for furniture and firewood. The tamarack or the larch, which has a fungus that resists decay, So it's a good tree to be used for fence posts and railway ties. All right, so the steps in harvesting trees. So the first step is planning the cut. So a careful review of the site is done. Careful planning is done before any action is taken. Next, a road has to be built into the area. So that's the next step, building a road into that area. Next would be the felling, which is cutting down and delimbing the trees. After that, dragging the logs to a central loading point, hauling the logs to a sawmill, then preparing the site for reforestation. It's also called scarification, and then it's reforestation, which is reseeding and replanting. So next we're talking about greenhouses and greenhouse farming. So just some pros and cons of greenhouse farming. So pros, it increases crop yields, so profit maximization, there's a stable yield, the conditions for growing the plants are optimal, you have more control over pests, so pest control, protection from animals and invasive plant species, there'll be protection from weather, from storms, from droughts. You can have production of crops all year long because you're controlling the conditions there for the plants. You can also grow exotic plants that you couldn't otherwise grow outside in the external environment. And some people make a living from greenhouse farming, so jobs. But because there's pros, there's going to be cons of greenhouse farming. You're going to need an expert to set up the greenhouse. There's a lot of upfront costs just for building and setting up the greenhouse. You're going to have plenty of knowledge to grow those crops successfully. There's high operational costs, keeping, for example, temperature control, the water control, and so on. A lot of maintenance efforts are necessary. A wrong setup could lead to an easy spread of pests, pollination issues because there's no pollinators. They're space consuming. It's a long-term project. You have to probably get official permissions and permits and so on. There's going to be risk of vandalism and theft and limited crop yield opportunities. We're just going to take a look at some couple videos here on greenhouses and the pros and cons. All right, so next we're just looking at global problems. So firstly is erosion. This is when soil is being blown away by wind and water, which leads to, for example, desertification. As a result of drought, desert takes over agricultural land. For example, North Africa once had very fertile land, but frequent and long-lasting droughts have led to desertification. Areas of Brazil and West Africa, vegetation was removed, the soil became hard and useless for growing crops. Areas of Europe and United States, high levels of agricultural chemicals in the water systems have caused serious pollution. Pakistan, irrigation was used a lot. So irrigation helped to boost their production at first. But this excessive irrigation also brought salts, the salts that were dissolved in the water. So those salts were brought because of the excessive irrigation, and that salty soil makes it impossible for plants to grow. So it's consumers' demands that help determine what kinds of crops are produced and how they are produced. So producers and consumers, we need to understand this complex web of life in which we live and respect the balance that exists.